Theotiste Cotard Paulin, and I was born in 1750 in Canada. By the magic of Halloween, I am with you all today in 2015. And by the magic of magic, I am speaking French, but you are hearing it in English. I'm going to talk to you today about Canada, about the Revolutionary War, and about my husband, Captain Antoine Paulin. This is his portrait right here. Nice looking man, if I say so myself. By the way, two of my descendants are here today. My 4 times great granddaughters, Kitty Wilson and Lynn Abercrombie. I don't know where she went. Oh well. Oh well. In the early days of Canada, from the European point of view, it was all about fur trading. And in order for France to secure its monopoly there on the fur trade, it needed more people. It needed settlers. In King Louis XIV's reign, in the latter part of the 1600s, finally some programs were established that did help bring more settlers. One of those programs was called Daughters of the King, and this is how it worked. They found women who would agree to go to New France. By the way, these are reputable women. Young orphans, young widows, women whose prospects didn't look real good in France, and they agreed to go to New France, and in return the king would pay their dowry. Here is what one dowry was: 450 pounds, including a small chest in which to put the dowry, 1 headdress, 1 taffeta handkerchief, 1 pair of shoe ribbons, 100 sewing needles, 1 comb, 1 spool of white thread, 1 pair of stockings, 1 pair of gloves, 1 pair of scissors, 2 knives, 1,000 pins, 1 bonnet, 4 lace braids, and 2 pounds of silver money. And lest you feel sorry for these mail order brides, they were not like mail order brides. Once they got to New France, they were able to pick who it is that they wanted to marry. They ultimately had to pick somebody, but they didn't just have to take the first guy that came up to them. Kind of had a good deal. Another program that they had going, a man by the time he was 20, a woman by the time she was 16, was supposed to get married. If they did, on their wedding day, they got some money. If they did not, by then their parents were fined. They get married, they start having children. Once they have 10 children, they got an annual pension. And if they made it to 12 children, they got even more money. If an indentured servant who had come to New France, when his term was up, if he decided, oh, I want to go back to France, they went, not happening, you got to stay. Soldiers, they encouraged soldiers to stay once their term was up. Trappers and traders, when the boat arrived with the marriageable women, they had 15 days in which to get a wife. If not, they weren't going to get their license renewed. They were serious about populating the region, and they were successful. Let's see, in 1663, they had 3,000 settlers. By 1763, they had 70,000 settlers. By the time I was born, in 1750, my family had already been in New France for several generations. My husband is Antoine Paulin. He was born in 1737 in Grenoble, France. 1963 Winter Olympics, Grenoble, France, at the base of the French Alps. It's in the southeastern part of France. He was meant to be a priest, but he traded place with his brother and he became a soldier. And in 1755, when he's 18 years old, he travels with General Montcalm to New France to fight in the French and Indian War. Okay, let's jump ahead a few years. It's now 1759. The British have won the French and Indian War. New France is now ruled by the British. Well, let's talk a bit about what life was like for the people in French Canada before this conquest. We in America call it the French and Indian War. The people up there called it the conquest. The French Canadians were Catholic. Being Catholic, they were used to looking to their priest for guidance. The land ownership was feudal. The person who farmed the land was not the person who owned the land, but there was no poor landless people in New France. Everyone who wanted to farm some land, there was some land then that was given to them by their seigneur to farm. It wasn't given to them, but they were able to farm it, and in return there were some things given to them. So it was like society was taking care of everyone. The civil laws were very different than are the British laws. Consequently, we French Canadians were not happy that the British were now had control of where we lived. The bishop in Quebec at this time, his name is Bishop Briand. The governor is a guy named Guy Carleton. The bishop wants his parishioners to be happy, so he works on Governor Carleton, and he is successful. And Governor Carleton goes to London. He spends 4 years lobbying Parliament, and what comes out of that is the Quebec Act of 1774. The Quebec Act allows the Catholics to continue to be Catholics, the church to continue as it is done. It allows the seigneurial system of land management to continue. It allows the French civil laws to continue. The French Canadians are now happy. The Quebec Act acknowledges their language, their customs. They're happy campers now up in Quebec, Canada. Just a little bit south of there, what else is going on in 1774? The colonists are unhappy campers. The Intolerable Acts, the Boston Port Act, the Quartering Act. They hold their first Continental Congress in 1774. They write a letter to us French Canadians asking us to join their cause. But we're happy now. We've got the Quebec Act. Why would the colonists think that we French Canadians would be interested in joining us, or in joining them? It's because we were a conquered people. They assumed that, of course, we would not want to be under the British thumb anymore. And what does our Canadian bishop think about all this? Well, he worked really, really hard on the governor to get what ultimately was the Quebec Act. He wants to keep the British happy now that the British have done what he wants. So what does he do? He tells his French Canadians that if they help out the rebels, if they join the rebels, they're going to be excommunicated. You're not going to be a Catholic anymore. You're not going to be part of our community. You're not going to receive the sacraments. You won't be able to be buried on sacred ground. And let me tell you, for us French Canadians, that was big business. That was quite a threat. That slowed a lot of us down from joining up with the rebels. Also, other things happened that made the French Canadians not trust the colonists. One of the big things was a letter that came out of the First Continental Congress written by John Jay, addressed to the people of Great Britain. Of course, it was like to go to England, but no, we got a hold of it. We got it translated into French, and it got passed around. And let me tell you, it slammed the Catholics. It slandered us. We were so unhappy at the attitude that was projected in that letter. Also coming out of the Continental Congress was another letter written by a guy named Richard Henry Lee, and it was addressed to the inhabitants of New France, the inhabitants of Quebec. And it was playing all nicey-nicey and encouraging us the idea of freedom and please join us. It was like the Continental Congress was talking out of both sides of its mouth. We were not comfortable. We did not feel trusting of the Continentals. Why would the colonists care that we French Canadians joined them? Well, the colonists cared a lot. They felt like that the British would use Canada as a springboard for attack on the colonists. And lo and behold, in fact, that was one of their big strategies. If you look at the map that I've passed out to you, and to me maps are so important. They explain so much. Did you ladies get a map? Do we have more maps back there? There's some back there. I've highlighted in blue the riverways, and of course riverways, the water, that's like the interstate highways of the day. That's where things happen. And you'll notice that if the British can control this Hudson River Valley, they split the colonists in half. They separate New England from the southern colonies. And from the British point of view, it is the New Englanders, particularly the Bostoners, that are the big troublemakers. Right. So if we can keep that stuff from spreading this direction, that was a huge part of the British strategy. So if the Continentals can get the Canadians to come on board, the French Canadians, that would be a good move. Okay, let's talk about Benedict Arnold. What do you think of when I say Benedict Arnold? Traitor. Well, let me tell you, long before he was a traitor, he did a lot of really good stuff. Okay, it's April 1775, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the Siege of Boston. The British in Boston are surrounded by rebels. Okay, Ethan Allen. What do you think of with Ethan Allen?
Furniture.
No! That's not what you were supposed to say. He's with the Green Mountain Boys of Vermont. Anyway, yes, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. This is, okay, April is Lexington and Concord. Mid-May now, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. If you look at your map, Fort Ticonderoga, in this upper part of New York State, they capture Fort Ticonderoga. By the way, Fort Ticonderoga originally was called Fort Caroline. And my husband, dear Antoine, with the the French soldiers in the French and Indian War, they built Fort Caroline. So anyway, they capture Fort Ticonderoga, they capture Fort Crown Point, just north of that. They cross north into Canadian territory, and they have a siege on Fort St. John, and they get armaments. They get cannons. Very significant. They get those sent back to the Boston area. They get set up around Boston. This is part of what ultimately led to the British giving up Boston, leaving Boston. Very significant thing that happened, them going up there and getting those armaments. Benedict Arnold has a proposal for invading Canada. He thinks that with less than 2,000 men, they could subdue the soldiers, the British soldiers in Canada. In June of 1775, the Congress agrees and decides to invade Canada. It's going to be a two-prong approach. Benedict Arnold up towards Quebec City, and General Schuyler and Montgomery over to to Montreal. Look at your maps again. Okay, Benedict Arnold, Quebec City, and to Montreal, we're going to have General Schuyler and Montgomery. Schuyler actually gets ill, and it's Montgomery who actually ends up taking it. The distance between Quebec City and Montreal is 150 miles. So that's the plan. In mid-September then, Benedict Arnold takes off from Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is just right outside of Boston, with 1,100 men. They're going to cover 350 miles. They're going to go through the Maine wilderness. It's going to take them 45 days. They're going to suffer starvation. A lot of guys are going to desert. People are going to die. He starts out with 1,100. he gets to the Quebec City area with only 600. Okay, what of my husband, Antoine Paulin? Well, after the French and Indian War, he decides to stay in Canada. He marries me. We settle in St. Denis in the Richelieu River Valley. St. Denis, it's highlighted in yellow on your map. I also highlighted, you'll see Coopersville. That's where we end up after the war. And I've also highlighted Fishkill. This is where I spend a lot of time during the war, and I'll talk more about those in a minute. Anyway, he settles in St. Denis and marries me, and we have some children. And where am I? In September of 1775, Colonel James Livingston is charged with recruiting French Canadians to join to help seize Fort Chambly. And if you look at your map, just underneath St. Denis is Fort Chambly. It's at this point then that my husband gets involved. He's now 35 years old. He's mature. He's had experience in war. And in 2 months, he will be made a captain. By mid-October, General Montgomery captures Fort Chambly. They also capture the British colors. And this is the first trophies of the war. It's sent to the Continental Congress. In early November, Fort St. John falls. If you look, that's just underneath Fort Chambly. And then in mid-November, Montgomery takes Montreal. Good job. On the same day that Montgomery takes Montreal, Benedict Arnold, now up here in the Quebec area, they begin to have skirmishes around Quebec City. Now, if you've never been to Quebec City, let me tell you, Quebec City is built on a cliff, and it has great walls all around it. It's a very fortified town. After Montgomery gets a hold of Montreal, secures it, leaves some guys there to take care of it, Montgomery now comes up to Quebec City, and on December 31st, they attack Quebec City during a blizzard. Unfortunately, they're defeated. Montgomery is killed. Benedict Arnold is wounded, though not, he's still in play, but he is wounded. In January, just a few days later, or a few weeks later, my husband's company is annexed to the 2nd Canadian Regiment, led by Colonel Moses Hazen. Let me tell you a little about Hazen's regiment. It was nicknamed Hazen's Infernals because of their bravery, their stamina, and their discipline and hardiness. They were also called Congress's Own regiment, because they were not supported by a colony. They didn't have Virginia or Rhode Island or Massachusetts to support them. They were Congress's own. And their flag, the regimental flag, is an orange flag, and in yellow cursive letters are the letters C-O-R, Congress's Own Regiment. After the defeat of Quebec City, the troops remain there, waiting on reinforcements. Congress and George Washington work on sending some reinforcements to them. They scrape together what looks like, on paper, 2,500 men, but most of them aren't fit for duty. Disease, desertions, the expiration of their enlistment. Left only about 600 actual men fit for duty, and that's not enough to launch an attack. And then they hear the ice is breaking and that British reinforcements are arriving from Europe. 13,000 men under British General Burgoyne. Well, our men decamp and they flee. They start heading up. This always drives me crazy. I want to say down, but it's considered up the St. Lawrence River because it's heading away from the mouth. Anyway, they start heading back up the St. Lawrence River. Back in the Montreal area, we're in May now, May of 1776. There's an outpost called the Cedars. We have 390 men there. They hear that 600 British are coming. The guy in charge there goes for reinforcements. the guy left behind, well, when the British come, he just surrenders. Doesn't even put up a battle. And then when the 100 reinforcements come, they're ambushed. They're all prisoners now. And even some of these prisoners are tortured by Indians who are in league with the British. It was not a pretty picture. The invasion is falling apart. Well, Congress gives orders for troops to head back towards Quebec. General Sullivan sends 2,000 troops to 3 rivers, Trois Rivoirs on your map, between Quebec City and Montreal. They are expecting only 800 enemy, but it turns out there are 6,000. 6,000 of Burgoyne's men. The Americans attack, but they're repulsed, and as they retreat, they encounter Indians, other Canadian loyalists. Like I say, it's not a pretty picture. By mid-June 1776, my husband is back with me and my children in Chambly. Burgoyne's men are coming. General Sullivan has ordered that all the French-Canadian property there, and now we're right in this St. Denis area, this is on the Richelieu River, that all the property be destroyed. My home burned. Oh. And we barely left. Burgoyne's men are coming, we barely left, and our 8-year-old son, Amable, goes missing. He was back talking with some British officers. Oh my Lord, praise God he was not hurt. By August, we're in Albany, New York, a refugee camp. Albany's on the Hudson River, down here in lower New York. There's one last battle in the invasion of Canada. It takes place in October 76. We're like a year from the start to the finish. This takes place on Lake Champlain. Now it's right there just south of the border with Canada, and you may not appreciate it on this map, but that lake is 125 miles long and 14 miles wide. A sea battle is going to take place there. Benedict Arnold puts together 10 ships that can ply those waters. The British have to dismantle one of their ocean-going vessels to remake some vessels to fight on those waters. And we lose, the Continentals lose. This invasion of Canada is the first military initiative of the Continental Congress. Even though its objective has not been reached, it has been quite successful in that it has bought the Continentals time. It's weakened the British. It's delayed by a whole year other things that the British have been wanting to do. And it also gives time for the French to get more on board and ultimately support us. Okay, by November of 1776, my husband, myself, our children, we are in winter quarters at Fishkill Supply Depot. That's highlighted on your map in the lower part of New York State. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Fishkill. Okay, a few of you have. It's a supply depot. Supply depots are important in war. A lot of important stuff happens there. Yes, many of the revolutionary battlefields have been memorialized, but not this area. Today, this very day, in Fishkill, New York, there's development. There's a small bit of that land that's still vacant. There are people today raising funds, trying to get something done up there to memorialize the importance of that place. Your American Spirit magazine, the May-June 2014 issue, had a story on Fishkill Supply Depot. Okay, now July 1777. General Lafayette is in Pennsylvania with George Washington. Lafayette's only 20 years old. My husband is now 40 years old. Lafayette comes from the same part of France as my husband. The children and myself remember Antoine speaking fondly of his associations with Lafayette. My husband participates in the Battle of Brandywine. You can see that marked on the map. It's near Philadelphia. He participates in the Battle of Germantown, which is also near Philadelphia. The Battle of Saratoga, which is up midway up the Hudson River. This is where Burgoyne the British do finally now get down into this area, trying to cut off New England from the rest of the colonists, and we win. My husband also participated in the Battle of Monmouth, which is in New Jersey, and the final battle of the Revolutionary War alongside Lafayette at Yorktown, Virginia. He was with George Washington at that terrible winter at Valley Forge. He's mentioned by name in 2 of George Washington's letters. I am so proud of my husband, and I know that my 2 fourth-time great-granddaughters here are very proud of him also. Captain Paulin fought for 8 years in the Revolution. He lost his home, he lost his property, we even lost children. There was always talk of a second invasion of Canada, and it was a good that it was, because it really kept the British on their toes. But I'll tell you, the French-Canadian fighters, they always looked forward to that second invasion, feeling it would be a success and ultimately they would be able to go home. But unfortunately, it did not happen. There were 2 faltering beginnings. One of them was in early 1778. My husband joined up with Lafayette near Albany together for that invasion, which was aborted. Later again in 1779, my husband led a scouting party into Canada to gather intelligence for an invasion. Again, it didn't happen. What happened to us French Canadian after the war? Well, we're refugees. We have no home to go back to. Our home was burnt. My family and others like us, we lived for several years in refugee camps in Albany and in Fishkill, New York. Until the summer of 1786, we lived in a refugee camp. That last battle was 1781. The Treaty of Paris was in 83. 86, we are still in refugee camps. The promised bounty lands weren't coming. George Washington himself wrote letters on behalf of the French Canadians. Lafayette wrote letters on behalf of us French Canadians to get these bounty lands. Ultimately, it was the state of New York that provided those lands. And in 1786, my husband and I settled on 900 acres on the west side of Lake Champlain, just 2 miles south of the Canadian border, near the town of Coopersville on your map. My dear Antoine dies in 1813. The year before that is the beginnings of the War of 1812. The children and I remember Antoine sitting on the porch, watching the American soldiers head up Lake Champlain for battle with the British for another invasion of Canada. No one is sure exactly how many French Canadians fought with the rebels, anywhere between 500 to maybe 2,000. We do know in 1778 that the 2 Canadian regiments had a total of 450 French Canadians at that moment. Why did most French Canadians choose to not support the British? Well, as I've said before, they were threatened with excommunication. They very much were put off by the disdain shown by the Americans towards Catholics. There were other incidences that turned them away, turned away people who were riding the fence. One of those instances involved Ethan Allen, 7 months before Montgomery successfully captures Montreal. Ethan Allen was up there recruiting, had some men with him. Things at Montreal looked kind of, and he just made a judgment. I think this would be a good time to just go ahead, let's attack. And he does, and he's not successful. The people, the Indians, the French Canadians, a lot of them just wanted to do nothing. Y'all just fight it out. We're just kind of here. And, but they were forced to choose sides, and if they're going to choose sides, they want to choose the one that they think is going to win. And at that point, the British won, Ethan Allen lost, so a lot of people at that time chose to go with the British. Why did people like my husband choose to fight with the British? There were people who were there during the French and Indian War who saw how the British treated the people, how they treated our property, how they treated our churches. They burned so many of our churches, and there was no call for that. Others, like my husband, wanted freedom, wanted self-government, wanted the better life. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of the Society of the Cincinnati. A few of you. That also was featured in the American Spirit magazine a couple years ago. Once the Revolutionary War was over, the officers agreed to keep in touch with one another. They wanted to make sure that they were able to get their promised half-pay pension. My husband was in the society. In fact, this portrait here pictures him wearing the ribbon and pin of the Society of the Cincinnati. That society is in existence today. It's sort of kind of like DAR in that a person has to have direct lineage to the patriot. But unlike DAR, in DAR, my husband, Antoine Paulin, descendants of ours, as many of those that want to join can join. With the Society of Cincinnati, only one living person, period, per patriot can be in the organization. Wow. The name Society of the Cincinnati it's named after Cincinnatus, who was a Roman leader in 458 BC. He gave up everything to go and serve, and then when his time was up, he went back to his modest beginnings. And that is what my husband and many others of those who fought in the Revolutionary War did. They gave up what they had, they fought, and then they returned to their simple life. I myself contributed so much to the cause. I lost my home. I lived as a refugee. I was supportive of my husband. I met his needs. I too would love to be listed as a patriot. But I never learned to read or write. I didn't keep a journal. I hope someday one of my descendants is able to document my service. I know that my 4 times great-granddaughter, Kitty Wilson, is working on that right now. And I thank you, Kitty. And I thank y'all for your time this afternoon.